Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. It's a great pleasure to welcome you back to the Schemmel Forum and to welcome a friend of many years whom I've encountered just at the time of my life and work in advocacy of the arts and humanities was morphing into the study and advocacy of democracy, and in particular, the role that citizens play in making democracy work. It was my privilege to be engaged by the then president of Radio Free Europe, who is again the interim president of Radio Free Europe, Kevin Close, whom we've had here. I was consulting with him on the possibility of creating a democracy center at the Radio Free Europe headquarters in Prague. While the project did not succeed, it afforded me the opportunity to witness at close hand the transition from autocratic rule to democracy that was occurring in a country that had suffered the chilling oppression and indignities of the Soviet role there. It was a magic moment because there was a readiness, a kind of infrastructure for the transition in Prague. There was Václav Havel and a group of about a dozen public intellectuals who were ready to recapture and embrace freedom and build a new democracy in their homeland. Jiri Pehe was one of that group. For a while, it seemed like a Camelot. Everything seemed possible. This cadre of patriots, beginning in the late 80s, moved through some rites of passage, working with Radio Free Europe, working and writing articles for the Open Society Institute, and ultimately serving in the cabinet of President Vaclav Havel. Jiri Pehe was a key member of that inner circle. He was the director of the political cabinet in the office of the president and continued as his external political advisor until the end of Havel's term in 2003. Meantime, in 1999, he became the director of New York University in Prague. Dr. Pehe was no stranger to New York. He spent some years of his exile there, where he was, and this is my favorite piece of his bio, he was a night receptionist at the famous Algonquin Hotel while studying at Columbia in their international studies program. He continues to serve as a pundit on political development in Central Europe, which brings him to our World Affairs Luncheon seminar today. He will speak on a disturbing topic, the emergence of anti-liberal politics in that area, manifestations of which we read about and hear about in the news. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Pehe to the podium.
So good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation, for the opportunity to speak here. I was here actually a few years back, I think 4 or 5 years ago, so I know Scranton quite well as a result, and again this time I have the privilege of staying in a hotel which actually is a former train station, and that is really a very special experience that I tell everyone about when I go back to Prague. My topic today is, as Sondra said, slightly disturbing. At the same time, I hope I will be able to end this presentation on an optimistic, or at least a slightly optimistic note, which of course, given what is going on now in some parts of Eastern Europe, especially in Ukraine, may not seem to be as obvious as it should be when I finish this talk. I will start with some general assertions. Eastern Europe, or East Central Europe, I should be more precise, because I'll be talking mainly about the 4 Visegrad countries, that is the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland. the Central Europe entered the world of democracy building at a time which was in itself very confusing for many Western countries. We tried to build a system of liberal democracy at a time when the paradigm of liberal democracy in the West started changing profoundly. And one of the reasons for this changing paradigm was the changing nature of the market, because the fall of the bipolar model, bipolar world, resulted in, let's say, opening of gates for global markets, their global functioning, and that, in my opinion, changed profoundly the nature of democracy as well, and I will talk about it some more. But certainly, if you remember 1989, this was a period of great hopes. Francis Fukuyama at that point wrote his famous first essay and then the book called The End of History, and we all hoped that he was right and that the history would sort of end with the victorious march of liberal democracy everywhere. But 25 years later, we can see that this has not happened entirely, and certainly not in our region. One reason for that, as I've mentioned, is the changing nature of the relationship between the market and democracy. If we go back in history, we can see that the origins of democracy, liberal democracy, can be traced to the rise of many other products of modernity, such as the nation state, the rule of law, modern media, civil society. All of those things emerged approximately at the same time. And certainly, initially, democracy was very closely tied to the notion of strong civil society, and at the same time to the notion of the market. In fact, some philosophers, Adam Ferguson or even Hegel, talked about market as one form of civil society. And rightly so, because civil society needed or could develop in Europe because there were these emerging centers of independence or points of independence within the formerly hierarchical system of absolutist monarchies, which, of course, tied to the rule of law and many other things that I've mentioned, created this environment for the rise of modern democracies. At the same time, the liberal democracy was tied to the notion of the nation state, and it was the nation state was the natural arena for liberal democracy. I'm mentioning all of these historical facts simply because this or much of this has changed over the last few decades, and we now have a different situation in which the market functions globally. It is dominated by big transnational corporations, which are certainly based on a different model of economic model or different kind of functioning than the kind of capitalism we had in the early stages of the development of liberal democracy, and there is a degree of inequality when we compare the strength and the influence of this globally functioning market system, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, the national democracies which still work and function within national boundaries with all of their cumbersome, slow processes, which cannot really compete as far as the speed, flexibility, and so on with this globally functioning system of global market. And I think it's important to mention this sort of slightly theoretical level because it had a profound influence on how democracies developed in East Central Europe. When those countries parted with communism, they believed that renewing or adopting liberal democracy will be fairly easy because it seemed like a static model. You have to do certain things. You have to constitutionally make sure that there is division of powers, checks and balances, regular elections. You ensure the rights of individuals, the rule of law, and so on. And there you have it. But it turns out that this model that seemed to be so obvious and so easily acceptable changed itself profoundly with the fall of the bipolar world, and certainly, if you look at how that one important dimension of this liberal democratic system was built in Eastern Europe, that is the market, you can see that it was to a large extent created from the outside by these big international corporations which saw a lot of opportunities there. They went into those local markets, and if you look at the structures of those local markets today, you of course see small-sized businesses and mid-sized businesses, but not anywhere near as far as their number and influence to what you see in the United States or in Western Europe, and you see an economy that is heavily dominated by these huge international corporations, which really do not have much interest in promoting the local democratic culture. They are there for profit, and they come and go, and that is certainly one huge difference from how democracy actually developed originally in the West, when where it developed, as I mentioned, sort of hand in hand with a local market economy, and so on. So this is one big problem that we have faced in Eastern Europe: this changing paradigm of democracy that is under pressure from global markets, and although this impact is, of course, can be felt anywhere in the West, it's been much more pronounced in those countries which have weak civil societies, which have no democratic traditions, and so on. This brings me to my second point, and that is the civil societies. Civil society is, of course, a very important structure, organism for the functioning of any democratic system. If you look at the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, we can see that there were some foundations of civil society in those countries, in some of them more, in some of them less. Poland certainly, even before 1989, had its solidarity movement and a very strong Catholic Church, a very strong underground publishing industry, and so on. Hungary functioned as a sort of liberal communist regime in which independent groups could to some extent exist without being persecuted. But Czechoslovakia was a very rigid neo-Stalinist regime where civil society was basically crushed after 1968, after the Soviet invasion, and existed only in the form of small groups of intellectuals such as Charter 77 and so on. So all of those countries started their democracy building with very weak civil societies, and that is, of course, another obstacle to building a vibrant democratic regime, because while you can create political institutions or certain political processes or certain market mechanisms from above, you cannot create a civil society from above. You cannot simply decide that as of tomorrow there will be a civil society, because there will be none unless people are ready to exercise their citizenship, behave as active citizens, found groups and for a common purpose, and so on. And this is something. This is in a way a culture that was totally crushed and destroyed under communism. Yet another problem that these new democracies had to deal with was the privatization process. On the one hand, of course, the privatization process was very beneficial because all of the economies of these countries were fully nationalized. That means controlled by the state or by the Communist Party. Again, in Poland and Hungary, slightly less than in Czechoslovakia. There was some private sector in Poland and Hungary. There was none in Czechoslovakia, but it is clear that to create a market economy, it was necessary to privatize those economies. So that was a beneficial and logical step. At the same time, this rush towards privatization in a way also damaged the notion of anything public. Public goods, public space, because that was to some extent psychologically connected in the minds of many people and politicians with the former regime. So this confusion between the public and the centrally controlled state, this mixing of the two notions was sort of a political and psychological problem that was very difficult to overcome. At the same time, of course, any new initiatives to establish public space in the form of public radio, public television, or many other traditional forms of the public space that, for example, Jürgen Habermas described so aptly in his book about the creation of the European public. That all of those initiatives were to some extent also undermined by this privatization process, that where private interests very quickly colonized this sort of budding public space, and privatized many initiatives and efforts that would have led to the creation of vibrant public space. Of course, this is yet another problem, because for functioning democracy, you need space, public space, in which the public can deliberate, discuss issues of importance in a rational, structured way, and this was in these post-communist countries very difficult to do, partly because of this privatization of public space. It was all accompanied also by enthusiasm, ideological enthusiasm for the sort of neoliberal approach to society. So there's a whole generation of people, maybe two generations of people in all of these post-communist countries in Central Europe that were given to this neoliberal ideology, believing that anything that is private, individualist, and so on is has a special value that we can put above anything public. This was, as if this was not enough, unfortunately this process of privatization also led to the privatization of political parties. And that is a serious problem still today. What I have in mind is the fact that political parties, when they emerged after 1989, emerged as, of course, as weak groups with relatively small membership. They were established by new political elites. That means mostly from above. They really didn't grow from below, from civil society. as sort of mass organizations, which was a problem in itself. But at the same time, they presided over the process of economic privatization, which gave them tremendous power. So we have a combination of political parties that are small, weak, new, inexperienced, and they are trusted with this incredible power to privatize huge public assets into the hands of new entrepreneurs, new economic groups, and so on. Inevitably, it has led to the privatization of political parties themselves. They have become dependent on the new economic groups and interests they themselves have helped to create. And so to this day we have in East Central Europe political parties which are very sort of closely tied to various non-transparent economic interests, groups, oligarchs, and a lot of politics you see in East Central Europe is made behind the scenes, so to speak, and this is to some extent the result of this process. In the Czech Republic, we have even a special name for these individuals and groups that actually control politics from behind the scenes. They are called godfathers, which is quite appropriate given the fact that those people and groups often behave as mafias. And it is certainly a huge problem for some Czech political parties, but the same problem can be seen in Slovakia or in Poland, where you have very powerful local or regional businessmen and entrepreneurs who basically are able, with their political influence, to buy entire local organizations of political parties and then manipulate them to their advantage to get public tenders they want to get, and so on. So that is yet another problem that I think needed to be mentioned. We also have to understand that these new democracies emerged at a time when, or after a long period of communist indoctrination, when a lot of people no longer understood the philosophical meaning of the traditional Western political ideologies. So there was a lot of talk about liberalism and conservatism and socialism, but if you went a bit deeper, you would discover that people really didn't understand very often what these notions meant and what it was to be, for example, liberal or conservative. So liberalism, if I give an example, was a notion which many people, many intellectuals in these emerging democracies subscribed to, but their idea of liberalism was that it's freedom without boundaries. That being liberal means that I have freedom to do whatever I want, and I have very few or no responsibilities. Very few liberals in this new environment, including some top politicians, believe that the rule of law is something secondary, that you really don't need to bother with it too much. So, for example, in the Czech Republic, the man who presided over the privatization process, Václav Klaus, the prime minister at that time, and later the president of the Czech Republic, openly spoke about the need to run away from lawyers. He said they slow down, they slow things down, and the rules and laws are something that would slow us down in our effort to privatize the economy and so on. So there was some basic misunderstanding what liberalism, which has always the notion, the ideology, has always been closely tied to constitutionalism, the rule of law, rules, what it actually means, and so on. So this is also, or this was a serious problem, and it took quite a few years for people to actually learn gradually or relearn in some cases, because Czechoslovakia, of course, before World War II was a democratic country, to relearn what these notions actually meant and what they stood for. As if this was not enough, we need to realize that all of these countries for 40 years or more were sort of frozen in time. There were certain emotions and tendencies which were sort of frozen by the communist regime. People were not, for example, able or allowed to express nationalist feelings too much, or if they were used very instrumentally and organized by the Communist Party or communist parties, and so after the fall of communism, much of this came to the surface. This sort of delayed nationalism that emerged in East Central Europe, and this sort of delayed nationalism, this realization that we can organize our societies also along sort of nationalist lines, not just communist internationalism and so on. This nationalism clashed with yet another effort, and that was the march to Europe. All of these countries, shortly after the fall of communism, declared themselves to be European, belonging to the West, and therefore they wanted to join the European Union as quickly as possible. So there were two tendencies which sort of clashed repeatedly. One of them was this modernizing tendency of political elites, on part of political elites, to bring those countries into the European Union, to modernize the institutions and political processes with the help of the European Union, which meant adjusting to demands of West European countries and adapting or transferring a lot of institutional know-how from Brussels and elsewhere to those countries. And on the other hand, you had this nationalist tendency, this resistance to this march back to Europe, where various populist leaders would say, you know, this is premature. We first needed to solve some of our problems at home, and it was inevitable that this would not produce good results. And indeed, while all of these countries adopted their march to Europe in 2004, and they were admitted as new members of the European Union, at the same time you could see that right after they became members, there were new populist movements and nationalist parties springing up all over the place. The governments basically in all of these countries, the governments that brought those countries into the European Union lost in the next elections, and they were replaced by parties with a much more sort of pessimistic view of the European Union. So this belated nationalism posed and is still actually posing a problem for that region. One, I mentioned that the march to Europe, the accession, EU accession, was in many ways a positive process. It was a truly remarkable transfer of know-how, institutional know-how, resulting in a very rapid institutional modernization. I would say historically unprecedented if we take into account how backward institutionally those countries were in 1989, and how quickly they managed to transform themselves. But at the same time, and this brings me back to the topic of my talk, at the same time, this process of joining the European Union had certain illiberal or anti-liberal tendencies built into it, because it really didn't allow for real politics to take place in those countries. Their elites, political elites, were committed to bringing those countries into the European Union, and that meant basically being dictated by Brussels what they have to do at certain periods of time, what they have to adopt, how to adopt it, and so on. So sort of stifled this whole process, which was very structured and extremely difficult, sort of stifled the political process, natural political process. So it had a certain illiberal tendency built into it because it was heavily based on bureaucratic know-how, expertise, and less on free expression of political will. So it is. It sort of created a situation which was, after 2004, I think, ripe for the rise of these anti-liberal movements, which in some ways reflected the complicated past of the region, as if it took, as if we needed some 15 years before actually some of these tendencies which were latently present in those societies and were suppressed by this march to Europe and the post-revolutionary euphoria, as if they waited for 15 years to come to the surface. And of course, if you look at the history of Central Europe, you know that it's a place that before World War II had a lot of problems with nationalism, populism, xenophobia, and so on in different forms, and so some of these things started coming back after roughly 10-15 years of democracy building. And this brings me to yet another huge problem that these societies have had to deal with, and that is the past. In Eastern Europe or in East Central Europe, this is certainly one of the most discussed and controversial questions. How do you deal with the past? How do you deal with more than 40 years of communism and the questions such as who was responsible for it, who participated actively, who less actively, and who were the victims? And so we have these discussions in all of these countries which are painful and at the same time not really entirely open, simply because for any society that has to deal with its own past, you need, I would argue, for the society to do it openly and rigorously, you need some external pressure. That pressure was provided by the United States in Germany after the end of World War II. But we really didn't have that kind of pressure. So there was a tendency, or there still is a tendency, to sweep a lot of things under the carpet, not to discuss them openly. And that, of course, complicates, again, sort of learning more about how a democratic process should work, or it complicates the democratic process itself, because a lot of notions that are tied to this problematic past are used instrumentally for political purposes. To give you an example, in the Czech Republic, what we have is a very strong, officially sanctioned, I would say, political anti-communism. So that is absolutely understandable. 41 years of communism need to be dealt with and condemned and judged, but political parties took it upon themselves to deal with this period in the political language, on political terms, and therefore politicized this process of dealing with the past to the extent that it's very difficult to actually deal with the past anymore. So, for example, in the Czech Republic, but also in Slovakia, in Hungary, Poland, there are now institutes. Some of them are called the Institutes of National Memory. In the Czech Republic, the institute is called Institute for Study of Totalitarianism, which were created by political institutions, and they are supposed to officially deal with this problematic past. But the very fact that they were created politically and they are controlled by the state complicates dealing with the past, because the state has its own interests. Various governments have their own interests. So this unsolved past is really yet another problem in dealing with the communist era. And you have a slightly schizophrenic situation in some of these countries. You might have heard that there is now something that some political scientists call nostalgia. It refers to East Germany, and it refers to nostalgia for communism. It's this very strange phenomenon when people, on the one hand, condemn the era of communism. They agree with the official political interpretation. On the other hand, they are sort of hungry for the artifacts and cultural product of that era. So there is a big retro wave, one could call it. Certainly on Czech or Slovak television, you can watch TV series and films from the era of communism, and people watch it en masse because it sort of brings back, especially for the older generation, this something that they could call home. That's something that's an era in which they lived, grew up in many cases, spent most of their lives, and while they are on the one hand forced by political process to condemn that era in sort of black and white terms, on the other hand they sort of yearn for the cultural products of that era. So that again complicates or adds to the anti-liberal tendencies in the region. Then there is, of course, an issue which I could call constitutional. In most of these countries, it was decided early on that they would function as parliamentary democracies, which, in contrast to the system that exists in the United States, means that the power is vested in the government and the prime minister. It's this relationship between the parliament and government, the government that plays an important role in those democracies. The parliaments are elected not on the basis of a majority system, that means people electing individual candidates in single districts, but people vote for political parties. And this all created or led to the creation of a system which, on the one hand, of course, is fully in line with what is common in Europe, where these parliamentary systems, with the exception of France, are used and are common. But at the same time, it certainly is a system that is, I would say, more difficult to learn and absorb than the presidential system, where everything is tied to one particular person in the office of the president, and where candidates, and if it's accompanied by a majority electoral system, then of course it's a very similar thing on the local level, where you elect your senator or congressman. So these systems are sort of more complicated because they are to some extent more abstract, and at the same time they do not produce clear majorities. To create a government, you really need to search for coalition, you need to find a degree of consensus. So you are supposed to find something that is in short supply in those countries by definition, because they emerge from a system in which no consensus was possible, and the consensus seeking is certainly something that a lot of politicians and people in those countries do not know how to do. So there have been tendencies in some of these countries to replace or to modify the system. In the Czech Republic, there was a big discussion in recent years whether the country should not move from this parliamentary system to a presidential system. And because last year the constitution, or 2 years ago, the constitution was changed to make it possible to elect the president of the country directly. Before that, the president had been elected by the parliament. It started a big discussion about the nature of the whole system. And in this discussion, one could easily see how these old sentiments originating in the communist era, sentiments for a strong hand, for someone having complete control, someone who can decide quickly without asking people, that how these sentiments sort of re-emerge easily. When the current Czech president Zeman was elected, a lot of people saw it as a return to this strongman sort of form of politics, which certainly can be seen across the region. You can see in Hungary Viktor Orbán and his Fidesz party winning constitutional majority in the last elections and ruling in this kind of way, which a lot of people support and think that this is a good thing for Hungary, although quite clearly some of the steps taken by the Hungarian government are anti-liberal and limit the freedom of the media, have resulted in changes of the constitution, and so on. The same thing happened to some extent, to a lesser extent, in Slovakia, where Robert Fico, a socialist leader who started as a leader of a sort of populist movement, which would be very difficult to define as socialist, originally called Smer, was able to win in the last elections an absolute majority, and again, although he's been more moderate than his counterpart in Hungary, Orbán, we have seen some attempts to stifle the opposition and so on. Poland went through something like this a few years back, and fortunately got out of that, but with the upcoming elections may slide back into the same kind of political environment. What I have in mind is the rule of the Justice and Law Party in Poland a few years back, headed by the Kaczynski brothers. One of them later became president, and the other one is the leader of this party. And they certainly used their political party and their tenure in the government to take some anti-liberal steps. They were later defeated by a liberal party, but as I mentioned, in the elections that are due in Poland, they may come back to power. So we have seen across the region the tendency of the voters to put in the office politicians who are seen as strongmen, and at the same time they have openly attacked some of the liberal institutions or liberal foundations of democracy. They have these ideas about democracy as a sort of directed process, where and a process tied to specific kinds of nationalism and so on. On top of that, there is now a new trend in East Central Europe, which is perhaps most prominent in the Czech Republic, and that is the rise of new types of populist parties, which are very difficult to define in the classical political science terms, because populism generally has existed in Europe for a long time, and populist leaders, of course, were known for promising people what they wanted to hear. Those parties usually were strongly anti-elitist and so on, and they have existed in all kinds of forms. But what we see in some East European countries, and we can also see it in some West European countries, in the last few years, is the rise of political parties, which actually preach anti-politics. They actually say that the whole political process, democratic political process, is corrupt, and it's not usable anymore. And they have been able to achieve some very spectacular results with this kind of with this anti-political message. So in the Czech Republic, we had an election last fall, parliamentary elections, in which a movement called ANO that had been created by the second richest man in the Czech Republic, a billionaire, Mr. Babiš, actually finished close second, so they are not now running the government, fortunately, but are in the government. And if you look at their program, which was in itself sort of a very nebulous program, sort of a mishmash of everything possible, their main slogan was, "We are not like politicians, we work." With this simple slogan, they managed to get 20% of the popular vote, and they are now in the government. And of course, you can see it all over Europe. You can see it in Italy, the Five Stars Party of Grillo, and other parties which actually run with this anti-political message, which in itself is, of course, anti-liberal. So we can see two types of anti-liberal politics. One is this rise of these new anti-political movements, and then, of course, the strengthening of populist and nationalist movements. That's one group. And then you have yet another problem, which in this region that I am discussing is prominent again mainly in the Czech Republic, and that is the existence of the unreformed Communist Party, where you have a strong Communist Party which managed to survive for more than 2 decades, and this party is now the third strongest party in the Czech Parliament. It is certainly anti-liberal in all possible ways, because it is still very much given to the communist ideology. It really is an anti-system party in the sense that it really does not it doesn't like the parliamentary democracy, a liberal democracy as a system. So we have these troubling trends which are quite prominent in all of those countries, but certainly they are perhaps in some ways, most prominent right now in the Czech Republic. And this movement that I just mentioned, ANO, which means yes in Czech, that's a party that is called Yes. So this Yes party was preceded by yet another party that fortunately disappeared just a few months ago from the political scene, but managed to get into the government in 2010. It was called Public Affairs Party, and was also created by a very rich businessman who managed to galvanize the public with his promises, and pretty much the same message that we can now see in the case of ANO. What connects these new parties is is the growing influence of modern communication technologies, because they were all created and they all managed to rise very quickly with the help of Facebook and social media, where they managed to get a lot of people enthusiastic about their very simple message or messages, but they function as sort of, or they resemble bubbles. They were created very quickly, they grew, and then like the Public Affairs Party just disappeared, like a bubble that bursts. And so it's a new phenomenon which we can see all over Europe, not just in this region, and certainly it contributes to this anti-liberal trend in the region. So what is the current state of affair in the region? Certainly, we can say that politics are to some extent more oligarchic than they are democratic. As you know, it was Aristoteles who made that famous distinction between various political systems, and two of the systems he mentioned were oligarchy and democracy. He didn't like democracy, by the way, so much as the rule of people, but he also didn't like oligarchy. And we can see that all of those countries, not as much as, let's say, Ukraine or Russia, but certainly enough, are dominated by these very powerful economic groups and interests, or individuals, oligarchs, who play a very important role in local politics. So we have people who are extremely rich. They then at a certain point decided to invest the money in the media, and then in politics, like Mr. Babiš, who not only is now the second richest man in the Czech Republic, but he also owns two prominent or most widely read dailies in the Czech Republic, just bought a television station, and he also runs this political movement that is now in the government, and he has become the Minister of Finance. Just imagine you have a man who has run from tax authorities most of his life, and he's now the Minister of Finance, controlling the tax business in the Czech Republic. So one sort of common feature is this oligarchic nature of politics in these countries, which, as I have mentioned, has to do with the privatization process, the supremacy of economy over politics, and weak civil societies, weak media, and so on. Then another common feature in all of those countries is low political participation. People do not vote. They are disappointed with politics to the extent that in general elections you may have maybe 60% of the voters taking part, which maybe by American standards is not so bad, but certainly in countries that where there's so much at stake, one would expect higher levels of participation, and it's definitely not what it should be, and that of course involves not only participating in elections, but also being active in civil society. I have mentioned the disillusion with politics, and then there is yet another common feature that is that can be seen in all of these countries, and that is a very weak level, a very low level of trust in institutions and processes. People still have this tendency, which is inherited from the former regime, to sort of beat the system. You know, that's the slogan that a lot of people still subscribe to. And the communism, there was a famous slogan: those who do not steal from the state steal from their families, and this is still pretty much present in the attitudes towards the state and institutions, they are not ours, it's them. And although these new democratic systems were created as ours, yet there is this division between people who do not participate, who are governed, and those who govern, and they are seen as them, and we don't want to have anything to do with them. And finally, there's this nostalgia for cultural products, mainly cultural products of communism. So that leads me to a conclusion, or a set of conclusions. I think that in general, after what I have said, it may look that the democracies in the region are really not doing well at all. I would argue that they are not doing well, but at the same time they function in a very different context than let's say before World War II, and this is a positive message, because after World War I, as you know, in Eastern Europe, there were a number of states which tried to practice democracy. It didn't last for too long, and most of these nascent democracies very quickly collapsed and turned into dictatorships or authoritarian systems. Czechoslovakia was the only democracy that actually survived until 1938. And we can see that the environment in which these democracies work and function today is much more conducive to democracy. It is supportive of democracy because there is international context, the club of Western democracies, or clubs, I should say, the European Union, NATO, and other organizations which strongly support democracy building and human rights, civil liberties, and all of those things which are necessary for the existence of democratic regimes. So that is a positive message. Another positive message is that I think it is really also a generational issue, which is perhaps in some ways frustrating, because it's frustrating to see that things are moving ahead so slowly, but certainly it's a generational issue in some ways, because the older generation, people who spent their whole lives under communism, if I put it bluntly, are in most cases lost for the cause of democracy. They were able and willing to accept the language of democracy, the rituals, just like they practiced the language and rituals of the communist regime. But it is very instrumental. It is very much on the surface, and all you need to do is to dig a bit, to get under the surface, and you can see that this is a generation of people that is sort of imbued, permeated with basically, I don't want to say anti-democratic values, but certainly not entirely democratic values. And then you have the new generation. You have young people who are, as far as I'm concerned, the greatest hope for this region. People who are truly European in many ways, especially more educated young people who see Europe as their home. They travel, they are in touch with their colleagues from the West. If you see anything interesting going on in civil society in the Czech Republic or Slovakia, Poland, it is in most cases the work of young people who are extremely good at organizing themselves on the internet, and so there have been a number of initiatives, for example, in the Czech Republic, which is known for its high level of corruption. So there's been a number of initiatives organized by young people who decided simply to create programs, software, whatever, to monitor how various municipalities and regional governments actually spend money. And they have become extremely good at this, and they monitor basically all public transactions. They monitor how money is spent. They monitor contracts that are signed and put them on the internet. And so this is very hopeful, and I think that eventually it can really lead to some improvements. To finish my presentation, I would say that where we are now could be well described by the title of a book I wrote a few years back, and I called the book "Democracy Without Democrats." We have been able to create institutions and procedures and mechanisms to a large extent with the help of Western institutions, and this process has been quite fast. And I mentioned the huge transfer of know-how and institutional modernization. All of that happened in a fairly short period of time, but this dimension of democracy, this institutional dimension of democracy, or procedural, is quite different from democracy understood as a culture. It means culture of democracy as a system of values that a person needs to internalize and identify with to be truly democratic. Tolerance, the culture of discussion, all of the things that one sort of absorbs by simply growing up in a democratic environment. And of course, it has to do a lot with the development of civil society, with citizenship, with how much people are actually active as citizens. And the second dimension of democracy is lagging behind in all of these countries. So on the one hand, as I mentioned, they've been able to create this institutional framework, foundations, procedures, so the facade looks good. But if you go inside the building, you discover that it's not always so great, that there are still a lot of undemocratic values and tendencies. And so I think that it will take some time before these two levels sort of are balanced. In 1990, Ralph Dahrendorf, the famous political scientist and sociologist, gave a lecture on the democratic transition, and he said in his lecture that it will take about 5 years for all of those countries to create the political institutions of democracy that sort of function, not well, but sort of function. It will take about 10 years to create a market that sort of functions. About 15 to 20 years to introduce real rule of law, where people actually respect certain rules and law. But it will take 60 years to create a full-fledged democracy with a real democratic culture. Means, he said, it takes 2 or 3 generations. And I remember when we heard him then, we said he doesn't know what he's talking about. Czechoslovakia, a country with a democratic past. I remember Václav Klaus, the prime minister then, who said, you know, some of the things that he sees as a future development we had already yesterday. You know, he was very dismissive of Dahrendorf. The fact is that he was probably right, and in fact he was not the first one to make this prediction. It was already the first president of Czechoslovakia, Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, who was a philosopher. And when Czechoslovakia was established in 1918, shortly afterwards he was asked about the state of the country, and he by a journalist, and he said, well, now we have democracy, what we also need is some Democrats. And so the follow-up question was, well, when do you think this will happen, Mr. President? And he said, well, it'll take about 2 generations. And then he was asked, and why do you think 2 generations? He said, well, it's all in the Old Testament, because in the Old Testament, or in Torah, there is a story of the Jewish nation that is led by Moses from Egypt, and for some reason they stay in the desert for 2 generations, and that is a highly symbolic. It's not therefore for no purpose, because it actually is to express this very simple notion that it takes about 2 generations for the nation of slaves to be transformed into a self-respecting nation that sort of really wants its own freedom. And so I think that this is where we are. We are somewhere after the first generation, still in the desert, and hopefully we are getting to the promised land. Thank you very much. Well, there's a whole system of civic education that is now being created, and this whole process has been slower than it should have been, I have to say. I think there are several reasons why this has not been as fast as it should. One is that there were simply no people after 1989 who could teach democratic politics and civic education along the democratic lines, because no one had any experience. Second, there was this unresolved past where a lot of teachers of history, civics, and so on were teachers who had functioned under the communist regime, at that time, of course, sort of preaching to the students the official line because they had to, and many of them also compromised themselves by collaborating with the regime. So I met because I was on a panel that prepared some of the principles for transforming civic education in the Czech Republic, and I talked to some of these teachers, and I asked them, why don't you teach this more, and why don't you teach more about the pre-'89 history? And they were quite frank. They said, it's very difficult for us, because if I start teaching about the pre-'89 history, which is a necessary step to teaching about post-'89 and civic virtues and so on, the students will ask me, and what did you do before '89? And I am in trouble. So it's really, again, a generational thing. We now have a generation of young teachers who are no longer tied to the past, and they find it much easier to talk critically about communist regime, and also they are much better educated in teaching civics. But it's a slow process, and certainly much more could be done. I think that one big deficit is certainly, one big problem is the public media, where we have public television, public radio, but they are so much under the control of various political parties and so on that they really do not do their job the way they should. And I think that there could be much more, for example, on Czech television, teaching civics and democratic principles and so on.
The public space, public media, so forth. I don't do computers and things of that nature, so I'm not going to use the right terms. But Facebook and all these things that actually seem to have brought about Libya and all of the Middle East, how strong is that? I mean, that is now the public space.
Yeah.
And that's the public space of young people.
Well, certainly it's very strong in these post-communist societies, simply because I would argue the impact of these new technologies has been to some extent stronger there than in Western societies, where you had gradual development. So to give you an example, very few people in Czechoslovakia or in Poland had landlines before '89. So they skipped. There's this new generation basically skipped an entire era. They just moved into this era of laptops and cell phones, and they are very good at it. They also missed the era of sort of physical forms of civil society, people congregating as concrete human beings like you here, listening to a lecture or doing things together. That is in some ways alien to them. They organize on the internet, and they talk to each other on the internet. So there are these new forms of civil society in cyberspace, which certainly are very powerful, but they don't always have good results, because first, I already mentioned that all of this led to the creation of some new political parties, which were like bubbles. There was no content, nothing. It was just created on the internet. Then, in general, I think that these new social media are able to organize emotions, mobilize on the basis of emotions very well. So they can get thousands and tens of thousands of people into the streets and demand something and so on. But when they achieve what they set out to achieve, very often there is nothing left. There are no structures, and you could see it during the Arab Spring. Governments were toppled, and then it all disappeared. And I'm afraid that something very similar could happen in Ukraine as well, which also was very much this whole revolt against the government, against Yanukovych, was propelled by to a large extent by the social media, where people informed each other, mobilized, and the question is how long it can last. And of course, this is a very advantageous situation for all of these oligarchic structures, oligarchs, because they just regroup. They move from they are pushed from one area by an uprising such as in Ukraine, but they just moved into another, and because there are no structures left, nothing that would sort of defend the democratic movement, they sort of they move from one area to another.
Yes.
What role does religion play in the emergence of neoliberal politics in Central Europe?
So that's certainly one. In my talk I listed a lot of common features for all of these countries. In which features where they are all alike. But certainly, if you take religion, then there are big differences. Poland is traditionally a very religious country, with 90% of all people being members of the Catholic Church, and the church plays a very important role, and even a lot of people actively actually participate. They go to churches, and so it's a cultural and also political phenomenon in Poland, which has traditionally played a very important role. Slovakia is less so, but the Catholic Church, especially in the countryside, plays a relatively important role. Hungary that's about the same level. But it's more the division. There's this division between a fairly secular Budapest, the capital, which is some 3 million people in a country of 10 million, and then the countryside. And that also brings some important political differences between the countryside and a big city such as Budapest. The same in Slovakia, Bratislava versus the rest. And then you have the Czech Republic, which is probably the most secular nation on, I don't want to say on this planet, but certainly in Europe. And that has deep historical, there are deep historical reasons, one of which, or maybe the most important of which is the clash between, well, first the Hussite revolution in the 15th century, which was basically the first Protestant movement in Europe preceding Martin Luther by 100 years. And after that, a large portion of Czech society was sort of Protestant, Hussite or Protestant after Luther. And then, because it was ruled by the Habsburgs, who were Catholic, all of this tension between Catholics and the Protestants, majority of Czech aristocrats were Protestant at the time, came to a head, and the Czech nobles were defeated by the Habsburgs in the Battle of White Mountain in 1620. It may sound strange to Americans to go this deep in this far in history, but it certainly played an important role, because then after this, basically the Habsburgs beheaded the Czech elite, either forced those Protestant nobles to emigrate or executed many of them, expropriated their property, and the country was forcibly re-Catholicized. But as it always or very often goes with conversions, forced conversions, people don't accept them. They accept them on the surface to save their lives, but they don't really identify with it. So ever since that period, religion had real problems in the Czech lands, and certainly Catholicism was seen as an official doctrine for 300 years, but I would say actively hated by a lot of people. So when the Habsburg monarchy collapsed in 1918, Czechoslovakia, especially the Czech part of Czechoslovakia, very quickly basically parted with Catholicism, and at the same time it didn't go back to its Protestant tradition. So there's a high degree of secularism, and that is in some ways a problem, because especially the Czechs really don't have any natural, historically created hierarchies of values. It's very horizontal. It's not the vertical is really not there, and that, of course, I think contributes to a lot of social ills that we see in the Czech lands.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I feel very indebted to Jiri Pehe for giving us a wonderful lesson in the modern world and the desert that described here. I think about another wonderful European voice, Hannah Arendt, who once described the time between the two world wars as between the no longer and the not yet. And I guess maybe we're always in that area, the desert, the no longer, between the no longer existing and what's to come. So we hope that we'll be part of that. I want to remind you that we have a very busy month for Schemmel. We have 3 more lectures. One this Friday, Jesse Ferris will be speaking about the Middle East. On Monday, March 24th, we have rescheduled Dr. Logaval, his lecture on Obama in history, and that's going to be Monday, March 24th. And then on the very last day, March 31st, we have Celeste Schenck, the president of the American University of Paris. So I hope to see you a lot this month. Thank you for coming.